Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's Free Speech Week, and this is the second of two sessions that the Salem Center, two events that the Salem Center for Policy here at the University of Texas is holding to celebrate Free Speech Week, to get us reflecting on what free speech is, why it matters, and what policies and practices promote and which detract from it, which are consistent with it, and which are against it. The main line of our title for today's talk, I think, captures what we're trying to do with both talks: questioning the sacrosanct. As Ayn Rand would have put it, checking your premises, questioning assumptions. And the sacrosanct that's being questioned tonight is there a right to protest? Our speaker is Onkar Ghate, a senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, one of the leading scholars on Ayn Rand's work, and also, I think, one of the most interesting thinkers in the world today on the subject of free speech and freedom of thought. So I'm really excited to have him here tonight. The format's going to be Onkar's going to give a talk, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. We have a microphone up here so people can, or it will be there, it's the one I'm talking in now, and people can line up behind it and ask questions as is customary. So without further ado, Onkar.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and thanks for the center for inviting me. So let me just make sure I can be heard well? Okay, good. I can hear a little bit of an echo. So welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. I want to start by emphasizing what got me interested in this issue and why I think you should be interested in this issue. And then I will talk a little bit about how I think one should analyze the issue about a right to protest, or specifically a right to mass protest. The Trump presidency was punctuated by three massive protests. One not so massive, but I think sets the stage for the next two. So you have Charlottesville and the mass protest in Charlottesville and a reaction around the country to what happened there. A bit later, a few years later, you get the massive protests after the George Floyd killing. And then you get January 6th and a massive crowd at the Capitol, and at a Trump rally, and then at the Capitol and storming the Capitol. I view these issues as, those three protests, as interrelated, that the protest in Charlottesville, I live in Virginia, it shocked a lot of people and it scared a lot of people, and the reaction to it that people didn't seem too disturbed by. So if you remember the protest in Charlottesville, it's over the statues, the Confederate statues and other monuments being removed. It's people marching in the streets with placards, shouting, including things like "Jews will not replace us" and so on. People were genuinely scared, and I think legitimately scared about what was going on. And the reaction was not very strong in terms of condemning it, of what happened, but also of saying that, look, but in the US, we have a First Amendment. It's crucial to the Constitution. It's crucial to our conception of what we are and what our government is. And if we take the First Amendment seriously, there's a right to do these things. And we have to protect these people who are marching and so on. And then you get, after the George Floyd killings, you get, now the protests were nationwide. They were much larger. But I think partly in a reaction to thinking, well, if there's the other side who's marching in the streets and so on, we've got to do that too for our causes and for what we believe in. And you got that. And then I think you have to see, in part, January 6th as a response to that. That if you're going to march and you're going to protest, and if you remember so they were painted as it's all peaceful protests. But if you can remember back to what Seattle was like, and blocks of the city were taken over. And it was basically anarchy. The police department fled from one of its buildings in Seattle, and there were blocks of Seattle for days and days that were being run, in effect, by protesters. And it was things like that that in part January 8th, well, look, then we have to march for our cause and for January. And that's, I think, part of how to think about January 6th. And for all these things, part of the justification will be, look, if we take seriously the First Amendment, we have to think that in the US at least, maybe other countries don't do it like this, but in the US, there's a right to assemble, there's a right to speak, and there's a right to protest, and including these kinds of mass protests. So it will be put as under the cloak of, if we're going to take our Constitution seriously, we have to allow this, and we might not like it. And I'm guessing, at least for most of the people in the room, at least one of these protests disturbed you. Maybe for me, all of them disturbed me, but at least one of them think, like, there's something not right about this, and is it really true that this is justified or sanctioned by the First Amendment? And what I want to argue, and I'll try to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions, but what I want to argue is, I don't think it is. It's a misreading and a misunderstanding of the First Amendment to think of these things as they are protected by the language and the ideas that the First Amendment is trying and puts into law, and as kind of the bedrock law of the US. And to think a little bit what is in common between these protests. So one, they're mass protests, marching in the streets, and interfering sort of with the operations of a city, whether Charlottesville, the George Floyd protest, it's in a lot of cities. One of the most obvious ones is Seattle. And for January 6th, it's in DC, and then with the operations of the Capitol. So you have mass protests. They're protesting about that they want to, in effect, either change government action or government law. So the Charlottesville protest is they don't like that the local city government is taking down Confederate statues. That's among the things that they're protesting. And no, we don't agree with this action by the government, and it's being done under certain ordinances. So we want these changed, and we're marching in the streets in order to get these changed. After the George Floyd killings, it's protesting police departments, police funding. There's either defund or abolish the police. There was, if you remember, right after it was, basically headline news everywhere in the US, there was the issue of police immunity. And part of what I think, and rightly disturbed people about that incident, was the projection of the officer kneeling on George Floyd for minutes and minutes, projecting that the law is not going to touch him. And this was the issue. They have some kind of special immunity. And is that right? Should this be the way the law views and treats police? And so there were a lot in the op-eds of the newspapers and so on, a lot of discussion about police immunity. Is this right? Should the law be changed in regard to this and so on? And part of the protests then are trying to change the law. When we get to January 6th, it's they don't like, in part, it's they don't like the results of the election. They want to change it. So it's directed, most obviously, at government policy and trying to get it changed by mass protest and mass demonstrations. And the question is then, is that legitimate? And is this what the First Amendment is protecting? So the First Amendment has a number of clauses. It's protecting religious freedom and so on. But the two most salient here, and what everyone will refer to, is that it protects freedom of speech, and that these protesters and demonstrators are exercising their freedom of speech. And so we have to protect that. And it's the First Amendment talks about the freedom to assemble. So there's the issue of freedom of assembly, and to petition your government for grievances. And that to be able to do that, this is a form of doing that, protesting and demonstrating in the streets. It's a form of assembly, and it's a form of petitioning the government for grievances. And so this is it's a free speech issue, but more broadly, you can put it's a First Amendment issue, and it includes the issues of this is falling within their freedom of speech, and this is falling within their rights to assemble and their rights to petition the government for grievances. And that's what, in part, the First Amendment is protecting. And it is true that is what the First Amendment is protecting. But I don't think those actions fall, and these protests fall under either freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. And that's what I want to talk about now for 20, 30 minutes, and then open it up for discussion and questions. And there's 2 points. I mean, there's a lot you can say about what the actual meaning of the First Amendment is, why it is part of the US Constitution, what is the reasoning and arguments that led up to that. But that's a lecture in itself, or a series of lectures. So I want to focus on 2 aspects of thinking about the First Amendment and thinking about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that are really important from the perspective of looking at these kinds of mass demonstrations and mass protests. And the first is that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and this is true of all the rights protected by the First Amendment, but we're focusing on these 2. Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly require, to think like what the freedoms are protecting, they require require and include the right not to listen, not to hear, not to participate. There's no such thing as that you really have freedom of speech and that each individual has freedom of speech if I can walk into your living room and give you a lecture and you can't say, "Get the hell out of here." And the reason you can't say it, if I say, "Well, I'm exercising my freedom of speech," it has to be that you can walk away. So part of the whole idea about freedom of speech is you're free to articulate your own ideas, to advocate your own ideas, to talk to people who share those ideas, to argue with people who don't share those ideas, to try to convince them. But that requires that they want to listen, and they want to discuss, or they want to argue. And if they don't, they have to be able to walk away. And you're not really understanding, and you're not really protecting freedom of speech if you don't allow the possibility to walk away. And the same is true of freedom to assemble. So I can't go into your living room and start lecturing you. I can't also go into your living room and invite 5 of my friends because we want to have a discussion, whatever, a political meeting. And we say, well, we couldn't find anywhere else to do it, and we've got the freedom to assemble, so we're assembling in your living room. That can't be right either. It has to be, no, you've got a freedom to assemble and to bring people into a meeting or an organization. I mean, the freedom of assembly is a broad concept that includes a lot of types of meetings and gatherings. But it has to be that, one, everyone's a willing participant, so everyone wants to be there, and if they didn't, they could walk away. And that you're doing it, and so this is the second point, that you're doing it on private property. You're doing it on your property. You can assemble people in your living room and invite them and say, I'm having a meeting to discuss Karl Marx's manifesto, but you can't do it in someone else's living room, in someone else's house, in someone else's office, in someone else's property. So if it's right to think of these rights, that you have to be able to say no and say, I'm not interested in this meeting, I'm not interested in this assembly, I'm not interested in what you have to say, and I'm going to walk away. And the other person lets them, okay, that is part of your freedom of speech to say, I don't want to hear, I don't want to listen. It's part of your freedom of assembly to say, no, I don't want to be part of this gathering, I don't want to participate in this. So the properly understood, the rights that are protected by the First Amendment, and the whole Bill of Rights is specifying some rights and putting them like explicitly, because government in the past histories of government has encroached on these rights all the time, and freedom of speech is certainly one of these. Freedom of assembly, when people were assembling to discuss, well, is our government any good, and maybe we need to try to change it and so on. These were clamped down and denied to people for centuries and centuries. So there's a reason that the First Amendment is singling these out, and that the whole Bill of Rights is singling out the rights they are for explicit mention. But it's not as though these are all the rights that a citizen of the United States has, or all the rights that the Constitution is created in order to protect. And one of the crucial ones is property rights. And you need property rights to make sense of these other rights. You can't make sense of freedom of speech if it was that, yeah, someone could walk into your living room and start lecturing you, and you tell them to get out, and they say, well, I'm exercising my freedom of speech. If you couldn't exercise your property rights to say, no, this is my property, you can go speak in your living room and lecture whoever's there, but you can't walk into mine. And the same for assembly, that you can assemble on your property, but not on anybody else's property without their permission or without their consent. Now, that's not how it is thought about today, and that is, in essence, the problem that I'm going to point out. But before going to that, to pointing out that it's not thought about like that today, and the kinds of problems that creates, I want to stress that if you think about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in this way, that it underpinning them and to make full sense of them, you have to see that they include and require an exercise of private property rights. These leave open, if you think of what the First Amendment is protecting, it leaves open all kinds of forms of demonstrations, rallies, political rallies. It certainly leaves open all kinds of forms of freedom of speech. So if you think, if you thought that, look, if it requires private property to exercise these rights, that's going to deny people the ability to speak, to engage in assembly and so on. That is not the right at all. And a model of what I think is a proper mass gathering, and let's put it in the political dimension, it's some of Trump's rallies, not the January 6th rally where he then says, let's go march on the Capitol, but the other rallies where they rent out a stadium. So it's a private gathering. They're paying for this. People can attend or not attend. They're not held hostage in the way that for some of these mass protests, when you're walking around in the city blocks and so on, you're holding the city hostage, and you're making people, in effect, participate in this who don't want to participate. And I'll expand on that. But when you have it that you've rented out a private stadium, and it can be like there's 40,000 people at a Trump rally, but it's like a sporting event, and it's a private event. Everyone there wants to be there. They've chosen to be there. No one who doesn't want to listen, if you don't want to hear what is going on at a Trump rally, you don't have to. So they're exercising their freedom of speech. They're exercising their freedom of assembly for a political purpose. And that is protect. That is what the First Amendment does protect. And if the government was to go and say, no, we're going to break up this rally, we don't like what you're saying, that should and is by the First Amendment prohibited to the government to do that. So, and you can take a Trump rally, you can take that you want to petition the government. I mean, think of the recent recall in California. That I think it's something that's done within the bounds of the First Amendment, that these are people going around trying to get signatures and enough signatures to meet the requirements of what is existing California law to get a recall going, and then who the candidates will be. And there's a whole process. And they're going around trying to get enough support for this, but they're doing it in a way that is respectful of people who don't want to participate in it, who aren't interested in it, who don't want to hear about it at all. So it was a real challenge for them to get sufficient a number of signatures to get this on the books. But that's again something that is, this doesn't happen in every political system and form of government. It happens in the U.S. That is the kind of activity that is protected by the First Amendment, and it protects this kind of political advocacy and arguing. And then there's in the U.S. there's a whole host of organizations that are privately funded, whose mission, in effect, if not explicitly, is to try to change the laws. There's things, ACLU, there's an aspect of this is what they do. The Institute for Justice, if you've heard of them, they were involved in the Kelo case, the eminent domain, and one of the things that they're trying to do is get eminent domain law and policy changed if not at the constitutional level, then at least at the state levels of how this power is exercised and how it's delimited. And these are organizations that are funded by private contributions whose purpose and whole intent is to try to change the laws. But again, I think of that as being done within the bounds of private property and what freedom of speech and freedom of association and assembly actually mean. Where the real question arises is how to think about public property. So to go back to Charlottesville and all the protests in all this, many cities across the U.S. after George Floyd's killing, and January 6th, it's all that they're gathering on public property. And then saying, look, because it's public property, basically we can do anything. You can't tell us we can't speak, we can't argue, we can't shout, we can't demonstrate, we can't carry signs and so on, because it's public and we're part of the public. And because it's public property, it's as much ours as anybody else's. And so we can do what we like. And unfortunately, there is Supreme Court decisions that certainly push in that direction. But I think those decisions are a misreading and a misunderstanding of the First Amendment. So the way to think about public property, if we're going to have public property, and I don't think we should, that's another discussion. But if we're going to have it, it can't mean that now it's a space where it's a free-for-all. Public property, and when you talk about the justification and rationale given for it, like public streets, public parks, public universities, the rationale is that we need it for a very definite purpose. And that purpose has to define how the public property is going to be administered and what's legitimate and what's not. So there are Supreme Court decisions. It's what's often cited as a 1939 decision, where the court says, among other things, that public streets, public parks, and the like exist in part so people can go around and argue with each other and talk to each other and voice their views and so. And because of that, then the government has to be hands-off of what people are doing on the public streets, in public parks, and so on. And that public streets are not created, and the justification given for them is not that we need some place where people can argue and debate. And they can't do it in their living rooms and their bars and the restaurants, so we have to create public streets for them to do it. Or public parks, like Yosemite. Like, it is really the purpose of Yosemite is for people to be at kind of loggerheads with each other. It's not that there's some hiking and supposedly a private development and so on wouldn't build hiking trails and so on. So we need the government to carve out Yosemite. That's the rationale that is given for them. And that rationale has to govern the way that public property is used. And so something like the public streets, which is, in the US at least, it's the main avenue. So Charlottesville, they're marching through the streets. And because it's public property, well, we can do this. And they might have to file and get a permit to do this. But you can do this and you can go around and say whatever you want. And it's a mass demonstration. So not only can you go on a public street, you can go en masse in it, so nobody can drive on it. So the very purpose for which a public street exists is so people can get to and from, you can get from home to your office and back. The very purpose is now eliminated or destroyed by the fact that you've got these people marching up and down the street, nobody can drive. And when you have a mass demonstration, and you think of that as, well, they're exercising their freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. One of the main questions you have to ask is, could a single individual do this? So Greg, in his introduction, said I work at the Ayn Rand Institute. I mean, could I march up and down the street with a sign, "Read Atlas Shrugged," or "Who is John Galt," and stop traffic for the day? If I did it, like, say, on a bridge that goes into DC, I live about 20 minutes outside of DC, could I march up and down and stop traffic for the day? And everyone, when you put it like that, no, that's ridiculous that one person could do that and block a bridge or the streets or block blocks of downtown. But there's no right that if one person doesn't have it, 50 people have it, or 100 people have it, or 5,000 people have it. If the single individual doesn't, you can't put a bunch of individuals together and say they have a right that none of them by themselves has. The only thing that you get with more and more people is an intimidation factor. So the one person, he'll be viewed as crazy. If it's 50 people or 500 people or 1,000 people, now it's, oh, I guess we have to take this more seriously. And the only way in which you have to take it more seriously is it's 500 people or it's 1,000 people. And they might riot, they might destroy property, they might break shop windows, they might overturn cars. And what you have is like a mass of bodies. And this is what happened in Charlottesville. If there was one person, I don't think people would have been scared. When you have 50, 100 people marching around, and there was a synagogue nearby, and they were terrified. And when you read the stories, they snuck out the back and tried to flee and so on. And I would have done the same, I think, if I was at that synagogue. And the only reason you would is because you've got a mass of bodies marching around the streets, shouting and, in effect, I think, intimidating people. So they might not be using violence in what means is they might not yet be breaking the windows of the synagogue, smashing cars and so on. But the main point is there's already physical intimidation involved in it. And no one should have to put up with that. And the fact that we have public property, that we have public streets or public parks, does not make that kind of behavior legitimate. And it's only because we have this kind of view, well, it's on public. In private, they wouldn't be allowed to do this. But in public, well, anybody can use these for whatever cause or reason, and particularly if it seems to involve a speech element or an assembly element, well, we've got freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, so we can't interfere with these things. And that, I think, is just, it's a major mistake. And it's from the moment you allow that this kind of demonstration is an exercise of freedom of speech, it's an exercise of assembly, you open the door to, the more people we could get into these kinds of demonstrations, so the more intimidating it is, the more our message carries. But the message doesn't carry. You don't have a better argument because you have 500 people or 1,000 people. All you have is more people. So what the message is a message of intimidation. And this is that you can see a ratcheting up of these kinds of protests. I think that's the reason you see it ratchet up is because, well, they've tried to intimidate us, so we've got to counter-intimidate, and they've got to counter-intimidate. And you see it getting to the point that you had on January 6th. So one of the things that I think is important in terms of thinking, when we have public property, it has to be administered for the purpose that it's created. And public streets, public parks, and so on are not created for the purpose of demonstrations, protests, and so on. They're created for everyone to be able, take public streets, for everyone to be able to go to and fro. And part of these, when you think of what's going on in these protests, I think of they add insult to injury. So it's not only now that you can't get to your office or you can't get back home, or it takes you 3 hours because you have to do a massive detour around because parts of the city are occupied and off limits. it's not only that, it's when you're caught in these things, I think there's a deliberate attempt in these that you're now a captive audience. So on this issue, I don't want to hear and I don't want to listen to your protest or to what you have to say. I don't want to be part of your assembly. Now you're caught up into the protests. You can't go anywhere, and you have people thrusting their signs and shouting at you and making you hear things that you may well choose not to hear. And again, something like a Trump rally that's done on private property, they can't do that. You just go. And there would be an issue if, say, a Trump rally or a church, you can give many different examples, if they were broadcasting so loud that people miles around would have to listen to the rally, the 3-hour Trump rally, and they're anti-Trump or whatever, and they don't want to listen to it, that would be an interference with their freedom of speech, because it doesn't allow them the freedom not to hear, not to listen, to turn away and say, no, I've got no interest in that. And this is, one of the reasons we have kind of nuisance laws and things like that is you can't go around. You can't have a rally that you cannot not listen to for 10 miles around, and you can't walk around on a street with a bullhorn. So, and again, if I did this as a single individual in my neighborhood, and I just walked around from 10 p.m. to midnight, giving a speech, giving this speech, and doing it so loud that if you're sitting in your living room, you still have to hear, and maybe you have to blast the TV not to try to hear what I have to say, and so on. That's an interference with your freedom of speech, because you're not allowed to walk away. And the same is true in assembly. If it's now, like I work downtown, so I have to go by this protest every day, and it takes me another half hour and so on, you're being roped into it when you're not interested in it. And freedom of assembly has to be that you can walk away. So I think the core of this issue of why we have mass demonstrations and protests in the US is they happen on public property, and there's a view, and it has, unfortunately, it's been a view that has been, in terms of the Supreme Court interpretation, and part of it is called a public forum doctrine, that things like streets and parks and so on are thought of as public forums that anyone can say anything they want and have demonstrations, protests, and so on. So that's the core of the issue. Now let me make one caveat. You could make an argument that the government, and this argument I think is more plausible without technology, or without the technology we have today than it is now, that there's a place that the government has set up, and a physical place, and this is the issue of why technology is relevant, a physical place where you can petition the government, and you can petition it for grievances, to put it in the language of the First Amendment. And it used to be that you would have to go to the court and the king and literally go and petition the king. And insofar as you think of the First Amendment as it's trying to say, well, the government, it has to be open to hear what the citizens have to say and hear when they have grievances and so on. There are arguments that when you look at the design of old cities, or if you think of DC today and the way the mall is used, that it's a square in which citizens can come and express their grievances and the government will hear it. I don't think you need such physical spaces you could argue that 200 years ago, it was much more plausible that you need some physical spaces like that than you need it today. But if you have spaces like that, they're not public property in the sense that anyone can do anything, say what they want, assemble, and it would be interference with their supposed freedom of speech or freedom of assembly to put any conditions, restrictions, and so on these. So you could argue that something like the mall in Washington, or part of it at least, is a forum in which citizens should be able to gather and express grievances. But for that to really be administered properly would be, I think, so one, as the Supreme Court will often put it, it would have to be content neutral. So the government could not be picking who gets to be a protester today, or have a demonstration, or just have a kind of rally where they're putting forth their grievances. It would have to be, you would need some kind of random selection like a lottery that people would file that we want to have some kind of gathering. You would limit the size, and it would just be representatives. So even if it's like you have a petition, I've got 200,000 signatures on this. You can't have 200,000 people come to the mall. That is just a recipe for having a riot and a recipe for all kinds of people's rights to be interfered with. And the mall can't really take 200,000 people without all kinds of infringements on private property. So it would have to be content neutral. It would have to be limited in size. And I think the other condition would be there would be no counter protests. To say that you have some kind of space in which you can give grievances to the government is not to say the government has to create some kind of space in which you can argue with other people. And what a counter protest is just, oh, well, if you're going to protest, we're going to come and shout against you. And that, again, is a recipe. It's too much like you've got gangs in the streets. And then you wonder, like, why does this break out into that shops get smashed and people get killed? And so it's a recipe for that. And again, unfortunately, it's too much thought of the way the doctrine of thinking of a public forum, like supposedly streets and parks as the public forums like this. It's not only that you can protest and speak, you have to be allowed to counter-protest. This is, for instance, I mean, you'll find this in many places, but this is the way the ACLU puts it, it's your rights as a protester. And think of I'm going to come back to this as a last point, but think of the position that this places the police in. The police are permitted to keep antagonistic groups separated, but should allow them to be within sight and sound of one another. And this is what happened in Charlottesville. And in Charlottesville, policemen were killed in trying to police this, that I think is an impossible situation to ask them to police. So the police think of themselves as we're upholding the law and we're upholding the Constitution. And we're telling them that the Constitution is you have to allow protesters and counter-protesters on city streets. And yeah, they might be 1 second from bashing each other on the head. But until that arrives, you can't do anything. And not only can't even tell them to go home. You have to say, no, you can gather. And of course, yeah, you have to be within shouting distance of each other and so on. And you're each carrying placards and things that you're going to use to hit the other person with. And we can't do anything until that actually happens. And then when it happens, people look at the police and say, why didn't you do anything about this? And in Charlottesville, so it was clear that it was like this demonstration is pretty close to breaking out into actual violence. I think that's part of why it attracted counter-protesters. So it went on for a few days. It attracted counter-protesters. If you watched any of the footage, and I watched much of it in real time that was on the news, I mean, it's clear. You've got two gangs that are close to blows. And the police were told basically to monitor the situation. And it was, I mean, there were two police officers up in a helicopter which crashed. And they think of it, and in effect, we've told them, yeah, this is what it looks like to uphold freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And it's not what it looks like, I think, to uphold freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But because we've misinterpreted the First Amendment, we think of it, and I mean, it's all over, and it's not a right, left, Republican, Democrat. Everybody thinks of it basically like this, that, oh yeah, what's one of the great things about the US is there's a right to protest and to mass protest. And that has been translated to on public property. And so what we have is, it looks like, I think all three of the situations, look, what you have is gangs that are massing, and what they're actually doing. Not every protester attending might think this is what they're doing, but what they're actually doing is physically intimidating. And we've told the police that, yeah, you have to allow this and try to protect it and not interfere. And then Charlottesville was like this. So a protester was killed, policeman, and then it was a big, like, why aren't the police doing more? And the protests after George Floyd were like this, that if the police do anything to break it up before anything happens, you're interfering with their freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And then when mayhem breaks out, it's like, why didn't you do anything? And we've given them contradictory orders. And that is because we don't understand what I think the basic law of the land actually is and what the Constitution is. And if we understood it, we would nip all these things in the bud, because you wouldn't have Charlottesville to begin that then escalates and a protester is killed and policemen die, and you wouldn't have the George Floyd protests on like these mass protests on public property that then in so many cities descend into chaos and violence. And you could have a Trump rally in a stadium and so on. You wouldn't have a Trump rally on January 6th on private property and then saying, let's all go march to the Capitol. And the Capitol also is viewed like that. This is the citadel of the people. It's public property. And if you ask them, what should the police have done? They would have, if they had opened fire on the protesters, they would have been dragged. I think it would have been unbelievable what would have happened. They would have been viewed as villains. They would have, how dare you do this? These people have First Amendment rights and so on. And then when the Capitol stormed and the police are outnumbered, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you use more force and so on? And to do this to our law enforcement is a real travesty. And it's because we don't understand what the law, I think, actually means. Okay, so let me stop there. There's a lot more that could be said, but that's the gist of my argument and just, I think, of what is going wrong in the way that we view mass demonstrations and protests in the US. So let's open it up for discussion questions.
Hello. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Gonti. You've actually made me think of a lot of things that I really hadn't given a whole lot of thought before. But if I've understood you correctly, it's like you're saying to some extent that public universities, including the one we're all in right now, in some ways should be treated like private businesses or just private entities. And if that's true, then we're living in a context of cancel culture where people are being basically canceled, losing their jobs for something they said that had nothing to do with their position as a professor at a university. So I guess I'd just like some clarification of what you think of, a university deciding they don't want an objectivist speaker for whatever reason, just beyond the pale, we're not going to have them. And would we stop at speech? If we treat all public universities like private entities, what would prevent public universities from saying, well, we only want so many Asian students, which obviously they do, or we only want so many white students? In other words, why stop at free speech? Why not just say, let's have these public universities decide, we only want a certain type of professor with a certain type of viewpoint, and also we want the student body to have so many of certain ethnic groups, racial groups. So I guess, you've made me really think about a whole lot of these different issues.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of issues to think about. I mentioned public universities in passing, and I mentioned them more from the perspective of, so let's put aside the term cancel culture and bring up some of the specifics. So there's been on universities where the students block other students, professors and so on, from attending lectures or from gathering because they don't like what's going to be talked about in the meeting and so on. It can be student clubs and so that kind of thing, I think, is akin to these kind of protests where it's a bunch of people, and what's relevant is it's a bunch of people who are physically preventing other people from hearing what they want to hear, from assembling to discuss things and so on. a public so I said in regard to public property more generally, I don't actually think there should be public property, but so long as you have it, it has to be, there's a rationale to have it. I think in the end, those rationales always fail. So they're not good rationales. But public streets, there's a rationale that we need these, and supposedly it won't be provided on a free and private market. People won't build streets. It's not true in the end. I think if you look at the actual facts and the actual workings of a free market. But if that's your view, then you're saying that streets exist for this reason. Public streets, they don't exist for people to demonstrate and protest and argue. And a public university has to have a charter for why it exists, what it's trying to do. Citizens should be very interested in what goes on in public universities, in public schools, insofar as we have these. Because you should think, like, what is the actual charter, and are they living up to it? I think of this generally for government decisions, leave aside the military and special applications there. The decision-making should be transparent. So it should be clear why they're making decisions. And if they were making decisions like, yeah, we're not going to have Asian students, that should be crystal clear so that the citizens whose property this supposedly is could say, like, no, this is not what we want as charters for our public universities, that they're going to make decisions based on race or based on a country of origin, something of its students. But all of that would be transparent. On the issue of thinking of public universities and free speech, I mean, that was a panel that was 2 days ago. And I think of public universities, let's put it government universities and government schools, as the violation of freedom of speech in America today. And there's a lot you could say about that, but one way to think about it is, if you did this for religious education, if the government was involved in K through 12 and university level religious education, to the extent that it's involved in secular education, people would think of that as that's obviously a violation of the First Amendment. And from both sides. So for the religious clauses, or the government can neither prohibit the free exercise of religion or establish it. And when you have the amount of government money going into K through 12 and university education, it in the end is doing one of two things. It's promoting certain viewpoints, and this is the issue of they have to choose faculty, and it can't be a free-for-all. So if you have a public university, there has to be a board that is appointed and so on. There has to be a whole process by which faculty are going to be chosen, what's going to be taught in class, and so what's not going to be taught in class, and what faculty won't be employed and so on. And that's, in terms of establishing a religion, we're elevating certain preachers and so on as they're the elect, and they'll get funds, and they have a leg up. And the people who don't are losing out. But the same thing happens, if it's not religious education, but secular education, exactly the same thing happens. And then on the free exercise, for religion, you're interfering with my free exercise. And this was the argument, or one of the arguments at the time. If you take my tax money and you give it to a religious institution that I think is a blasphemer, you're interfering with my free exercise, because my free exercise has to be, I support the religions or whatever religious figures, institutions, or that I want to support, and I don't support the ones that I don't want to support. And if you're making me support them, you're interfering with my free exercise. But it doesn't change when you go from religion to now you're telling me I have to fund these professors, these schools, these departments. I might not agree with their ideas, and yet you're making me do it. So the argument would run parallel in regard to universities, and one of the tragedies in First Amendment interpretation is that is not seen by almost anybody. Yeah, I think it's a distinctively objectivist view, or it's a distinctively a view that Ayn Rand had. But when you think in those terms, public universities, I think, are the major violation of the First Amendment today.
He says at a public university. I enjoyed the lecture, and I wanted to ask if we could delve a little more into what is it about culture today that both the right and the left are so just blind to violence in these protests. So, if you ask someone on the right, they'll just ignore that there was violence in the Capitol protests. If you ask someone on the left, they'll ignore the looting and the violence and the deaths and the Black Lives Matter protests. What do you think's going on there?
There's many things I think going on there. Two things but I don't think these are exhaustive, but two things I would highlight. So one, there is massive evasion. And I think when we're in a more tribal age or tribal environment, and part of what that means is that it's my tribe, right or wrong. And if you really have that attitude, my tribe, right or wrong, what it means is you don't care about right or wrong. And so why would you say they ignore what happened in January 6th, they ignored we don't care about that. We care, is our tribe winning? Not should it be winning? Is the right on its side, or facts on its side, or truth on its side? No, we care if our side's winning. So of course we're going to overlook that, anything that would cause us to be painted in a bad light and so on. And the other side doesn't, when you have two tribes, that is to think that we're in a tribal age. I think that's part of both symptom but cause. So the more people identify with a tribe, more that is how they're pushed and taught to think or not to think. But on a different angle, the more you're in a culture that pushes determinism, so pushes that you're a product, or put it a little differently, a victim of outside forces. And I think, unfortunately, our culture and our universities are basically our higher education. And that's not just in philosophy departments or sociology departments. It's basically in every department. They're deterministic, so which means in one way or another, they teach young people that you're a victim and a product of circumstances beyond your control. And the more people think like that, the more the issue of force doesn't matter to them. For Rand and for objectivism, and I certainly agree with this, it's why the issue of force is so much a central, or the central issue in terms of thinking about politics, is there's a vast difference between someone giving me an argument for which I can say, no, that is a stupid argument. I'm not listening to that. I don't even want to talk to you anymore. And I walk away. But the positive is I have control over my own mind. I can think what I think. And you can't interfere with that unless you bash me on the head. And that's why the issue, the moment someone introduces force, it's a vastly different category. But if it's just like there's outside forces that determine my life for me, you come to think, oh, I need safe spaces, and safe spaces doesn't mean safe from violence. It means safe from arguments and from facts I might not like. It's all put into the same category as those are outside things that are going to push me around, and I don't want to be pushed around like this. And we live more and more in that environment. And as a result, force is just seen as it's one of the things you use to try to influence people. And it's not a big deal. And I think that is also part of how people have reacted, unfortunately.
You gave a history of the ratcheting up of tensions in protests by mentioning three recent episodes where there were mass protests, Charlottesville, smaller, the Black Lives Matter protests on January 6th. But of course, there's been many other protests for a lot longer time. Even in the period you mentioned during the Trump presidency, there was the Million Women March or whatever. It's a big march right at the beginning. There were protests over the immigration bans. And then this goes back, of course, way prior to the last 4 or 5 years. So do you have a take on what is the history here? Has this been ratcheting up? Does it go in waves of up and down? What are the significant, and the answer might be this is just something to all figure out more about, but is there a history to when were the first of these kind of protests, and have they grown?
Yeah, I don't have a full history. I do think for sure you have to think about the period in the 60s and 70s, so both the civil rights issues and the student protests and the protests around Vietnam. And I think part of what happened is there's a lot to say about the civil rights protests, but once it became the student protest and the protest against Vietnam, there was an element in the country that thought, like, this is going too far, there's something really wrong with this, and the turn or swing to the right and getting out of the 70s and part of Reagan coming into, and it's like we need something new and something different. I think part of it was that there's something wrong with these mass protests, mass demonstrations that disrupt cities and disrupt peaceful life, the regular circumstances of life, that there was an element of real turning against that. And we're now back or getting, like that, this is what's ominous to me, we're getting more back to in cultural environment in which this is seen as normal and indeed in some ways as necessary, like we need to do this kind of thing. And that, I think, even when you read about the way some of the organizers involved in Black Lives Matter and things like that, the way they are thinking of it is in part that we need more and more of this kind of physical demonstration and physical action. But it's not just this, like that. I think this is part of what tribalism is, to say that we descending into tribalism. You're less interested in ideas, and then the issue of just how big is our tribe really matters, and can we show the muscle? So I think it's not been a straight line trajectory, and I think it's the civil rights in many ways, I think, unfortunately, it had to be that for the country to actually take seriously that there was massive injustice going on. You needed mass demonstrations, and it's more akin to civil disobedience, but I think mass civil disobedience is a special form of civil disobedience. So you had that, and then you had it, in effect, taken over by the New Left, and the country getting fed up with that, and a better period for a while, and now we're back on an ascendancy. That's the way I look at it.
You mentioned in your talk that assuming that we need a public forum to petition the government doesn't seem to belong to any particular political camp, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, but it does seem that it is rooted in an assumed importance of democracy and assumptions about how that should look. And whereas what you're saying a better version of the free speech enforcement would look like is less concerned about cultivating a democracy and more about the individualist view on things. And I'm wondering how those two values should be thought of in conjunction with each other and weighed together. And also, is the positive rights versus negative rights framework a good one for thinking about this as well? That is, your right to free speech is a right not to be imposed on by the government, as opposed to it's a right for you to be given by the government a public forum.
So let me take the second first, which is the positive and negative rights, or kind of spin on how to understand rights. I don't think that distinction is right. Every right is the right to positive, but the positive is to take action. It's not a right to some outcome. So a right to freedom of speech is a right to talk and so on. It doesn't mean you're going to convince anyone. It doesn't even mean that you'll have someone who wants to listen to you. But it's a right, you can speak, and if you find willing listeners, then you can speak to somebody. But you can announce your ideas, put them in public. It's a right to action. But it's a right to certain kinds of positive action. So from that perspective, every right, whether it's freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, is a right to do something. It's to take action. So it's a positive. And the flip side is that people can't interfere with this right. So there is a negative to it, that it means other people have to refrain, and it certainly means the government can't take action to interfere with this right. So every right has a positive and negative aspect to it, and the positive is primary. For all the rights, it's a right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. These are all positive actions. I have the right to take the actions that are necessary to preserve my life. I have the right to speak, to associate with people, to trade, that's liberty. I have a right to acquire and keep the property that I've earned, and I have a right to pursue my own happiness. So they're all positives, and then they can be interfered with, and that is, if you have a right to it, then the interference is wrong. But so they all have this aspect. So I would not think of it in those terms. It certainly means freedom of speech does not mean that the government has to provide you with a microphone or an auditorium, or any other individual has to. But that's just an aspect of what the positive is. It's a positive to take action. It's not a positive to an outcome. Remind me again what the first part of the question was?
Weighing the value of democracy.
Oh, yes. So if democracy, if you're using it in the sense of just the majority rule or something like that, then it only has one place, and that's in voting. You count the votes and the majority wins. I mean, that's why Biden won and Trump lost. You count them, and so in that context, it is important. But the U.S. is not a country in which everything is up for vote and the majority decides if we're going to have segregation or not, or we're going to have slavery or not. That's not how the U.S. system works. So it's not a democracy in the sense that every major political decision is made by a majority vote. In this issue, there is an element of, or at least can be an element, that there's genuine concern with, will people be able to advocate for their ideas? Will they be able and have means to try to change government and so on? And that is a legitimate thing to think about, and something that the Founding Fathers thought about what are the processes by which you can change law, and if we've passed bad law, how do you change them? And that's part of why I emphasize that a real understanding of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, allows for all those kinds of things. It allows for activity in which people are talking about, like, our government's screwing this up and screwing that up, and we need to change it, and this is what different laws would be, and we need to gather, and we need petitions so that our representatives see it's not just 5 people telling them this, like, it's a lot of people are saying this, and they should take that seriously. And so that is, you have to be able to do that in a representative form of government, which the US is. So those are important considerations. But I think the proper understanding of the First Amendment has taken those into account. So if that's what people are worried about, you don't achieve that purpose by thinking of public property in the way they think of it. Indeed, you undermine it in various ways. So that's why it's in this issue, it's important to stress that to say you can't do this on public property does not mean to say you can't do this. And you can't petition, and you can't advocate, and you can't argue, and you can't fight for change. It's just there's a right way to do it, which is protected by the First Amendment. And there are many wrong ways to do it, which are actually violations of the First Amendment.
One thing that often comes up is, I'll hear people say this is my right of free speech, but then they'll go out on Interstate 35 and call that their peaceful demonstration. Which, and obviously, I'm a free, as much for the right to protest as anything, but I'm not for blocking traffic. I love my car, I love to drive. But secondly, it seems as though we have a very unequal portrayal of these demonstrations. I hear all this talk about January 6th. I never hear anybody talk about when they stormed the Capitol during the Kavanaugh hearings. Because of course because that was okay, because that was being done by the left. It seems as though we need to have the same standards for everybody. I mean,
do I think our media is very good in portraying these kinds of things? No. And I agree with you with what happened during the Kavanaugh hearings, but it's a symptom of the same issue. So what has happened in terms of the law is it's been through judicial decisions that it's legitimate to have protesters in certain parts on the Supreme Court, in front of it, and so not everywhere. And once you start allowing that you will get situations where you have a whole mob that's breaking in, whether it's the Supreme Court or the Capitol, it's the same issue. Or do our media report them all equally? No. But I think unfortunately, I have a very dim view of our media, and it's all over. So do I think January 6th has been reported well? No. Do I think the protests around George Floyd were reported well? No. Do I think Charlottesville was reported well? No. And it cuts across the political spectrum as it's normally sketched, which I don't think is a very good sketch. But so part of what I said is that this is a problem that cuts across Democrats, Republicans, and they're all thinking about it wrong, and then often trying to take advantage or game the system by misreporting various things and so on.
What is the appropriate police response when a bunch of these people just show up, assuming you want to avoid excessive force and you want to avoid retaliatory violence from the protesters? And can you go into the distinction between a valid civil disobedience like you had in the 60s and a mass protest that would violate rights?
For the police, they should be able to break up these things when they're small and just beginning. But it has to be on the premise that there is no actual right to gather and protest and demonstrate on public streets, public parks. So when it starts happening, they should be able to break it up. But if it was known that this is not within your free speech rights, your freedom to assemble and so on, we'd have much less of it. If it was actual law and reported that, no, you don't have a right to do this, it would be broken up. So that's the main thing in regard to police. And they would be empowered that the streets are for passing through. And the moment you get 5 people who are trying to block traffic or so on, I mean, I'm from Canada. We had protests in Canada where the truckers were protesting. And they drive on the highway 5 trucks wide, it has 5 lanes, and they drive 20 miles an hour, and nobody can get through. So the police would come and they would arrest them and break it up. And when it's 5, not when there's 5,000 trucks, and they would be empowered to do it. So I think that's the main issue. And then the second part of your question was?
The distinction between the mass civil
Oh, yes, okay. So when you look at civil disobedience, let's take it first without mass civil disobedience. If you look at what civil disobedience is, it properly done, it's a respect for the law. You in effect have a test case that, we're guilty under the law, I'm going to accept the punishment, but we're going to try the case to expose that this law is unjust or is wrong and should be taken off the books. I was just in Tennessee, and I went to Dayton, Tennessee, which is where the Scopes monkey trial was. And this was Tennessee had passed a law that you can't teach evolution in high schools. And in Dayton, they decided the Dayton it still is a very small town, and the town leaders decided, well, this might be good publicity if we had the test case in Dayton for this. So you had a high school teacher who said, it's not even clear he actually did, but who said he taught evolution from this book and so on. And it was, we know he's going to be put in jail or at least fined. But it's to have a test case that we're going to take this trial, we're going to fight it, and we're going to try to expose that this law is wrong and unjust and should not be on the books. And that's a civil disobedience that still is respectful of the law. When you get mass civil disobedience, the mass is important because there is an issue of strength in numbers. And what that normally means, I think, is like physical strength. But when you look in the 60s of when you have these mass marches, for instance, you can understand why they wanted strength in numbers. So it is civil disobedience in which they're trying to showcase the segregation and the massive legalized governmental injustice that they're facing. And the normal response that you should make to people who want to change the law is do it within the system. So this again of what I brought up. I mean, you can write op-eds about this is wrong. You can form organizations that some are doing test cases to try to expose the injustice and irrationality of the laws. There's all kinds of things you can do. But when you have a group of people, as you had the blacks in the South, who have been disenfranchised, and you tell them, look, you should work within the system to change the laws, their reply rightly is, the problem is we can't work within the system. You don't allow us to register to vote. We're not treated properly by the police. And so on the strength in numbers, like when you have 5 of them, they might disappear in the back alleys of Alabama because the police, and I mean, these things happen, the police take them and kill them. When it's 500 or 5,000 people in a march, that's much less likely to happen. And so there is a real physical strength in numbers, but you can understand why they felt compelled that they need to do that. So there are specialized circumstances which do not apply to, I think, any of these the recent protests. Charlottesville, they can work within the system to say, look, we think these statues should stay up and so on. You don't need a mass gathering, and it's not civil disobedience. It's just a protest and a march. I think that is true after the George Floyd killing. I mean, there are real issues to think about how the police function. The issue of police immunity, as I said, that became a major issue for a few weeks that it was being discussed. And that is a real issue, but you can work within the system to change that. But when you're disbarring people from the very system that you're going to tell them to work within, that's a different circumstance. And I think that's part of what we had in the 60s and why the issue of mass civil disobedience was taken much more as it's a fight for justice rather than defiance of the law. But I think normally when you have mass civil disobedience, it's no longer civil disobedience. It's a prelude to war, in effect, or to civil war.
Thank you.
So I see a thread that a lot of the confusion that goes on is no one thinks about private property and relating to the actions that you're taking going on private property. Like we can see in England where they've got people who want people to have more insulation in their homes, so they're going to disrupt the roadways and keep moms from going to the hospital. Why was it that the founders of this country decided to leave property out of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution? Like, what was going on? Because I think we've been not dealing with property for a long time. Thank you.
So I'm not a historian of the founding, but my amateur reading of it is it's left out because of the issue of slavery. When you look more generally of when they're discussing rights and what rights are and so on, property is certainly mentioned. That it's not in the Declaration, I think it's because of the issue of slavery and of having property in an individual human being, that's not a legitimate concept. And that tension is there. And I think it's a way of avoiding that issue. But when you look more generally, like what is the theory about their view of rights and what it means to have a government founded upon this fundamental principle, it certainly includes property. And it's a later, and it's one of the massive philosophical and legal battles that is fought in the 19th into the early 20th century, is to empty property rights of constitutional protection. And I think the Constitution doesn't enumerate our rights, and property is certainly included among the rights that the Constitution is created to uphold and secure and to defend. And there's a long process by which they try, and fortunately has been successful, in vacating from our understanding of rights how fundamental property rights are. And when you look at the Supreme Court history and decisions. So I think we're in a period now, as a result of having lost that battle in the 19th and early 20th century, that very few people think about rights in the context of private property. But I think you can't understand rights, and this is certainly Ayn Rand's view and objectivism's view. You can't understand rights unless you think of them as aspects of a total. And one crucial aspect is property rights. There's basically one right, a right to life. And to make good on what that is, you have to understand freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of trade, freedom of assembly, and freedom of trade. All of these are underlined by property rights. And that, you can't have a proper understanding of rights without that. But it's been emptied deliberately, I think, from the understanding of rights in present-day America.
So I'm just curious if you can talk more about your thoughts on permitted demonstrations within public streets. Like I know during the Black Lives Matter protests last summer in Austin, a major part of Congress was shut down for those protests. What your thoughts are on that and how that compares to those same roads being shut down for like the Austin Marathon or something, because both are going to cause disruptions to what those public streets are meant to do, but one is politically motivated, but they both have permits to do so.
Yeah, I think it's other things equal. It's better to have a permitting process than not to have it, because it puts at least some that there's a process involved here. But from what I've seen, the permitting doesn't make sense. And it's in subtle ways, they're making discrimination based on the content, particularly when it's political, based on what the actual content will be of a protest. When you're talking about things like a marathon, I don't think it's a race and so on. I don't think it's at the same level, but I think all those things should not happen on public property. So I don't think there should not be parades on public streets. There should not be races, marathons. They're there for people to get around. They're not there we need a race every year to raise money for cancer. You can raise money for cancer in all kinds of different ways using private property. So if you're going to have public property, I think you have to take really seriously what its purpose is, and it has to be delimited to that purpose. So I would say none of those things should happen on public streets.
Can you address Facebook, Google, YouTube? I mean, obviously they're private businesses, but it seems like today they're going further in kind of banning people from their platform as far as certain posts being removed and all. And so obviously they're somewhat private companies, but a lot of conservatives are trying to make the argument that it's like the public airwaves and such. So could you address that?
They are like the airwaves, but the airwaves shouldn't have been public. So they're private companies, and they're essentially private companies. And if we take freedom of speech seriously, then and freedom of assembly and association and trade and so on, they have to have the power, just as you have or I have, to say, I don't want this person in my living room. I don't want to deal with this person. So they have to have that same power as private citizens owning property. And the fact that it's a big organization with a lot of people who've decided to assemble and trade together and so on, that is within their purview as private citizens. So it is true, unfortunately, that the government is more and more enmeshed in these companies, but that doesn't make them public companies. It makes them victims of government interference. And if we took seriously freedom of speech, what we would be doing in regard to Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on, is we would be going after the government to tell them, leave these companies alone. Don't drag them before Congress to explain, like, why is this person or that person not on your platform? How do you make decisions? What that is introducing into it is, and it's implicit but often explicit when you watch these hearings. We're going to regulate you, but regulate you is a euphemism. We're going to deny you your rights that you should have as private citizens owning private property if you don't manage your companies in the way that we would like you to manage them. And that is government coercion and intimidation. And rather than looking at Facebook and Google and so on, they deplatformed this person and they kicked this person off, what we should be outraged is is the way in which the government is trying to control these companies. I think if you look at Facebook, for instance, and if you look at Mark Zuckerberg's comments, and you look at sort of the chronology of the comment, he was much less reluctant to kick people off of Facebook and so on, until he started getting government pressure and government threats about, like, why are these people on your spewing what we think is misinformation and so on. And the fact that we as citizens didn't rise to say, leave him alone, you should not have this power, that was the problem. And the solution is not now I mean, what would it mean to say that, well, they're public? It would mean the government controls everything, and the government makes all these decisions. And you really think that's a solution? You're worried about the kind of power Mark Zuckerberg has, and your solution is, let's turn it over and give all control to Biden or Trump? That's not, and it tells you something, that that's not a solution and people are advocating for it. What they want is just the power to tell these companies how to run and who you can have on and who you can't. And it's the same, whether you watch Ted Cruz or whether you watch one of the Democrats, it's exactly the same mentality, that it is, we want to control what you created. And that in the US is an abomination.
Earlier you mentioned that that you don't think that there should be public property at all. Does that include things for proper function of government, like courts and police and military and things like that? Or is there like a distinction in the type of land they would own, like government land?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it as it's public property and owned by the government. The government is our representative or our agent. Like, we create the government. So in effect, we're loaning the government, here's facilities that you can use to run the courts and run government and so on. But it's not the government's the owner of them. It's the old non-American view is we're subjects of the government. And the American view is, no, the government's our representatives. They don't rule us, we rule them. And in that sense, we're granting them access to these things. But that's not to say the public ownership suggests too much of, like, it's the government that comes first and then they decide how this is going to be used. No, they're our agent. We decide how the Supreme Court will be used. And so we ratify the Constitution. And that's the way to look at it. So yeah, there would still be courthouses and police stations, but it wouldn't be thought of as the government's the owner of this. It's more like it's leasing it than it's owning it.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up now. I wanted to ask a last question that might be a good note to close on. We are in a situation where the laws now are what they are regarding public property. And there are demonstrations, protests, people are invited to different things. Different people think, given the state of things, in order to accomplish my political goals, what I need to do is hold a protest, hold a rally. With the law not changing, or until it changes, or unless it changes, what moral considerations do you think there are for an individual who's considering putting on, advertising, participating in a public protest, at a march, for example? Is it ever appropriate to do? Under what circumstances? What obligations might there be on a person organizing something? And that includes both cases where there's a civil disobedience component and cases where it's just meant to be a peaceful protest, or I guess the civil disobedient ones are supposed to be peaceful, but include on both sides of that. And that seems like a kind of large enough topic with a kind of theme to it that connects to the theme of the talk that could be a good note to close on. So let's have that be our closing.
There's a lot to say about that, so what I say won't be anywhere close to exhaustive. I don't go to protests and demonstrations. I would really have to think it's a last resort. So one of the things would have to be, I really think there's no other way to accomplish this goal, and it would take a lot for me to be convinced of that in our present circumstances, so including what the laws are now. So if it were true that you couldn't form other organizations, you couldn't hold rallies and demonstrations and meetings in stadiums and so on, if government were really clamping down on that, and then but they let us go into the streets and so on, so maybe that's what I need to do. That, in that kind of situation, I can imagine, but it really would be that I think there's no other way to do this. And then if it was, I thought this is the only way to accomplish this goal. I have to accomplish it in a way that is not going to victimize anybody. You're already victimizing, in effect, by going on the streets. But if you've got a permit to do that, and that this is what's being allowed, and you really don't have any other means to think that you can advance and advocate your cause. As I said, I think like in the 60s with mass civil disobedience, they had reason to think like the only thing we can do is march in the streets, and maybe that will get enough people to realize we are being treated by the government in a massively unjust way. But it would be, I mean, and if you think of some of what in the marches in the 60s, they really stressed that we're not here to intimidate, so don't even give the impression that we're here to overturn cars and beat up people. And so you go out of your way. We're not here to intimidate. And the fact that we're in numbers is more for us than it is like you should take seriously that if you don't do what we want, we're going to riot or we're going to do. So, and there was real, I think, attempt to say we're not going to riot. We're not. And if you read some of Martin Luther King, he's pretty adamant about this. So it would have to be not going to victimize the people, apart from you're interfering with streets and so on. And that you would really have to take seriously when it's a sizable protest. And I would be leery of, are sizable protests ever needed? But if it is, and this applies even to private mass gatherings, like when it was gatherings in stadiums, in sports stadiums, and they win a championship, I think they should be liable if they've done nothing to control the crowd, and so it escapes from the stadium and they've been liquored up and so on, and then there's rioting. And if you've ever, one of my colleagues at ARI was in France when they won the World Cup, and he was in Paris, and he said it was terrifying. There's people all over burning things, overturning cars, and the police rightly feel they're outnumbered and have to make a kind of calculation that if we intervene and use force, is it going to get worse than this? Do we sort of try to let it run its course and burn out versus having clashes and so on? And you should not, I don't think it's legitimate for sports teams and so on to put a city in that situation. And if it really is, like they didn't have any kind of crowd control and security, private crowd control, private security, when it's a champion game 7 of the NBA or whatever, where there's reason to think this could happen, they would be liable. And I think it's the same if you have protests and so on public property, streets and so on, and you're going to have a sizable crowd. You have to do the crowd control, not expect other people to do it. And if it's not like that, I don't think it's legitimate as well. So you really have to think of it as a last resort, and that it's not appropriate to make victims of other people just because you're suffering injustice. And you have to do everything to minimize that.
Okay, thank you. And in light of that, I'll ask people to exit in an orderly manner. After first thanking our speaker. And thank you all for coming.